This week, Jay Jacobs and Wade Baker from the Cyentia Institute are with us to discuss EPSS, the Exploit Prediction Scoring System. Stay tuned for Below the Surface. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 34, being recorded on Wednesday, July 10th for Wednesday, July 17th. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Mr. Alan Alford is here with us. Alan, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here again.
Yes, good to have you back on the show. It's great. We missed you last time, so we have him now, which is amazing. Also, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. Also, if you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all that on eclipsium.com/go. I'm excited to have our guests from the Cyentia Institute, which I'm told I can pronounce however I see fit, which is great because I often pronounce things wrong. It's good to know there's no wrong way to pronounce it. Your names are easy to pronounce. Jay Jacobs and Wade Baker are here with us. Welcome.
Great to be here, Paul.
Thanks a lot. It's exciting.
Yeah, it's good to have you guys. So I just want to start with a little background on the Cyentia Institute. Are you the only two co-founders? We have both founders on the show. Is that true?
Yep. That's true. Other people
Awesome.
work there, and we've got some,
Yes.
contractors and such. But yeah, we're the co-founders.
That's
Nice.
awesome. So what? How did you guys meet, and how did you come to create the Cyentia Institute?
I'll take a crack at that. So Jay and I worked together in a previous life at Verizon, both working on the data breach investigations report, and I did a lot of the sort of partner coordination and writing on the report, and Jay Jacobs did a lot of the data crunching on all the incident data we got. And, we loved that work so much, we thought, I wonder if there's a place in the market for a company that does data-driven research, but not at Verizon. And
without
thus
Verizon in the picture. Yeah.
Thus Cyentia Institute was born. So we do a bunch of research, analyze a bunch of data sets, and just try to understand security better and publish our research and hopefully make an impact for positive improvement.
That's awesome. I love that you got my brain turning. Like, take the project that you like engaged with you the most, that you loved the most, and then go create a company around that. I think it's a great model.
That was the idea.
As long as other people are willing to pay for it, it's a great model.
Right. That's customers are important. Yes.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Little detail.
So we've been chatting actually a lot on this show, as well as in other outlets, about all of the various scoring and tracking mechanisms for vulnerabilities, which is kind of amazing that we've reached this point. I think on the positive side, we actually have scoring and tracking mechanisms and multiple at our disposal. You go back 20 plus years, we didn't have any of that stuff. I remember having conversations recently where, you had folders for all of your exploits for things that of a particular version of software right before we had CVE. Today, it's amazing all of the scoring and tracking mechanisms we have. One of those is EPSS. How was EPSS born? Like, where did it stem from, and why was it created?
It came from research. We were doing some work through Cyentia with, I think we can say it, Wade. We were doing some work with Fortinet, and we were doing work with Kenna Security. And so Fortinet, of course, has worldwide distribution of their devices, IPS, IDS, looking for malware, botnet infections, all sorts of stuff. And they were able to at least centralize those detections for analysis. And so we were getting just all of these detections of essentially attacker activity for the most part. There's probably some academic scanning and things like that happening, but mostly this attacker activity. And then on the flip side, we had Kenna Security that was working with organizations and working on the vulnerabilities that they were finding and tracking their remediation and helping them prioritize. And so on one side, you've got what the attackers are doing, and on the other side, you have what the defenders are doing. And when you bring those together, you get a really interesting set of discoveries and things that you learn. And you can start to say, like, hey, are people actually using CVSS to remediate? Does that cause, do TENS cause faster remediation? Things like that. And that essentially started to lead to, can we predict what Fortinet is doing by the information we have in Kenna?
Mhm.
Can we look at that exploitation activity that we're seeing, and we see that tied to CVEs, and we've got all sorts of other data around CVEs. Can that information actually help predict what's going to happen in the future?
And I
And so
think the
that's how
key
it was
word there
born.
is the keyword is predict, right?
Right.
Because I interviewed folks from Kenna a while back. One of their data scientists was an awesome person,
Yeah.
but they were looking at the like if you have vulnerabilities and an exploit exists in some, there's different types of like proof of concept versus an exploit exists versus being used in the
Weaponized.
wild,
Yeah.
right? But they were
Yeah.
looking at tying those things together in an effort to help prioritize. Like I have all these
Yep.
vulnerabilities. Well, if an exploit exists, in what capacity, and how should that dictate if I patch it or not? Right.
Yeah, definitely. And we see that in the data. We see a difference between an exploit loaded in a Metasploit versus
Hmm.
listed on ExploitDB versus in some repository on GitHub. Like there's a difference in the amount of expected activity from either any three of those sources.
Right. But what EPSS is trying to define is a new vulnerability is discovered. What are the chances it'll be exploited? Like attackers are going to
Yeah.
not just exploit it, but attackers are going to use it. Is that the
I
algorithm?
mean, officially it's going to be, are we going to see it in the data we've collected about exploitation activity? And we've since expanded well beyond Fortinet into Gray Noise, Shadow Server, Cisco's now partner. There's probably more I'm forgetting. F5, a company called Flux. And so we're
Reversing
getting a
labs
lot
in
of,
there, huh?
yeah, reversing labs. And so we've got all this sort of activity that we're seeing. And so it's the probability that we're going to see it and from one of those sources.
Mm,
And so
I
that's
see.
what we're actually predicting. So we can say it's going to predict exploitation activity in the wild, but it's really, is that going to show up in one of those data sources?
I gotcha. And there's obviously a finite set of data sources, but it's from companies that are monitoring large swaths of the
Yeah.
internet.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
gotcha. I gotcha.
And I
So
mean, we
go
we
ahead.
do not have 100% coverage, and that's sort of the challenge, right?
Hmm.
Because nobody has 100% coverage. No one is going to see all this activity. And so what we try to do is say, given the activity that we see, and we see it on these types of vulnerabilities with these attributes and this activity on the internet already, what does that do for like a new one? Like we know
Mm,
that this new one is coming up. We know it's in this product, that we see this exploit published here. Is it actually being used? Like what does that all mean for something that we've never seen before? And that's what we're trying to do, to say, like, let's look at the past, trying to look, predict the future. And of course, part of that is saying, do we actually predict the future?
mm.
So
And so how do organizations use this data?
So we try to be careful about how we recommend people use it, because it's pretty easy to fall into a trap saying, like, oh, this is probably measuring risk. I'm going to treat it like risk. I'm going to take that score and just follow it. But that's not what it is at all, right? It's looking at exploitation activity. It has no idea what your local assets are, what compensating controls
Hmm.
you have in place, how much damage could happen if this is exploited versus this other one. There's all these things that EPSS has no visibility into. And so, as a practitioner, you have to understand that stuff about your own environment. It's sort of like this is EPSS is just looking at the threat side. You've got to understand your controls in place, the importance of the asset and impact and all that stuff, and then have that all come together. And that's how we recommend people do it. Like you can use it as like a triage score, because if there's no exploitation activity, you don't have to worry about anything else. But like even if something has a 1% probability, and that's what we're trying to output as a probability of an event in 30 days. If it has
Hmm.
1% chance of exploitation activity, that means 1 out of 100 of those are probably going to see exploitation activity, you know?
Right, right. And Alan, you had a question how it ties to the CISA KEV.
Yeah, so CIS's KEV database, the known exploited vulnerabilities. In my mind,
Yeah.
if it's published in KEV, that means it's
Yeah.
really, really out there and really, really going to be exploited. And yet,
Right.
sometimes I think you guys might score a something that's in the Kev is a lower EPSS score. And I'm curious, like, what are the
Right.
physics of that? Because it seems to me once it's out, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's another thing that we say. Like if you have other knowledge that something is being exploited, like even if like you have some senses in your network and you see something exploited, don't look at EPSS. Like you don't need it. You don't need to know what the score was. Like go treat it. And so same thing with Kev. And so there's a challenge with specifically with Kev because that is known exploited past tense vulnerabilities. Does that mean that they will be exploited next month?
Mm.
Right. And so, and we're coming out with a research report for EPSS where we look at everything on the Kev and we see, what was it, wait, about 2/3 of the
Something like
things
that.
that they
Yeah.
are reporting as exploited, we actually saw it exploited as well. So
Mm.
basically 1/3 of the things on the Kev, we didn't see
Not.
any data for. Doesn't
And
mean that it's
again,
not
that could be,
exploited.
yeah,
Right.
that could be because the data sources that we have are different than those that are a signal into the Kev that it's exploited. But it
Right.
also could be that it was exploited 5 years ago and isn't
And it's not
seeing any
exploited.
activity
Yeah.
anymore. Both of those
Right.
things
Right.
could be true.
And the other thing that we see in the data is that a lot of people will think of exploitation activity as a all or nothing, like something is exploited in the wild or it's not, and that is just absolutely not the case. There is so much variety. Like you can have something exploited a little bit or a lot, or every day, or one day a week, or once and never again, or it can hit the entire internet, which is extremely rare, or it's
Mhm.
going to hit, like what was it, Wade? Like 10% of the activity we saw reached more than 1 in 100 of the devices. I mean, it
Yeah,
was like
it's
a very small portion. Most of the majority of exploitation activity is isolated, sporadic, and localized to some extent. Local being, not the whole internet.
Okay.
Um, and so it's really hard to talk about exploitation activity. So if somebody says, like, if the Kev says it's exploited in the wild, what does that mean? Like, was it seen on one device at one place and a vendor caught it, or is it everywhere all the time, or is it some weird combination of that? So it's hard to talk about that. And so with the Kev, actually, Kev is an input into EPSS. So like we treat Kev as like, if it's thrown onto the Kev, is that going to increase the probability that we're going to see it in the next 30 days?
I
And so,
Yeah.
but I think for a lot of organizations, like if it's on the Kev, don't look at EPSS, like just go fix it,
Just
put
go
it on your
fix it.
priority list.
Yeah. And we're
So
actually going to dig into Kev more on the next episode with
yeah,
someone from CISA.
yeah. And I
Who
think it's a great
just happens to be a
resource.
friend of mine, and I'm like, dude, this is great. We need to talk about
Yeah.
this. But
Yeah.
Jay, I think you were that made total sense when you were describing how you use each of them, right? And I
Mhm.
Yeah.
think it's important information for organizations that I think are struggling with not only prioritizing, but how do I use each of these different scoring mechanisms effectively? And you basically summarized it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, the other scoring systems get a little bit more tricky. Like I'm constantly asked, how do I take EPSS and combine it with CVSS?
Yeah.
And I honestly don't know. Like I have no idea. I don't know. Like the reason I struggle is because I don't know exactly what CVSS is measuring. They say severity, but what exactly does that mean? And they say it's not risk, but it has questions about the technical impact and like the probability of
Hmm.
activity. Like I don't really know. So I don't know exactly what it's measuring. So I don't know how to include it in any modeling or anything.
and
And when
correlates pretty poorly with exploitation.
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is a
Yeah.
pretty
Well,
bad
and
predictor for that.
anyone can assign a score. Well, not anyone, but multiple parties can assign a score for CVSS. I think the nice part about EPSS is, and some people will poo-poo it for this, quite frankly,
Yeah.
is that it's a machine learning algorithm that's looking at data and coming up with a score. Whereas
Yeah.
CVSS is a human looking at various factors, depending on which version of CVSS you're talking about, and then coming up with a score, which is why we derive different scores.
Yep.
Yeah.
So some will say, well, AI and machine learning, they can't possibly predict what's going to be exploited. And they'll just poo-poo it because
Right.
poo-poo AI and ML and
Yeah.
cybersecurity, right? When I see it,
Yeah.
it's a buzzword. I'm going to ignore it. And you
Right.
shouldn't do that. Some people do
Right.
have that opinion. I don't agree
Right.
with it. What I did like about EPSS was the fact that if you take all those inputs and all of that data, we should be able to predict, right, what's going to be exploited.
Yeah.
And for that, I like it.
And the
I
great
think
thing
another
is,
strong factor. Sorry to
go
jump
ahead.
in there, but kind of to your point there, Paul. I think there's a lot of claims about the efficacy of ML and how it's going to make everything better. but I
Right.
hardly ever see it measured. Like, if we use it, can we measure a delta between what we were doing before and now the post ML performance? Hardly ever done. But EPSS can do that and does that. I mean, Jay
Mhm.
mentioned a report we have coming out here real soon. And it's exactly what we do. We say, hey, it made all these predictions. Let's look back over the past year, 2 years, and see how those predictions came out. And are we accurate? How's
Right.
it doing? How's it doing compared to other scoring systems and ways of figuring out is something going to be exploited? So, I love the fact that you can make these predictions and then go back test them to see how they're coming out.
And I'm sure that only makes it better. If you keep
Yep.
doing that, it's only
Yeah.
gonna get better, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we retrain the algorithm about once a year, and we're due to do it again, but we've been in
Mhm.
the process of updating our back end. And so we're going to be a little delayed, but it's going to be a lot stronger when we're updating it again here soon.
Sure. So what's the high level of what factors it takes into consideration, and how do you validate some of that data?
So how do we that's a long question. But essentially, like the way it works is it goes day by day when it's training. And so like it on a given day, we know certain information about vulnerabilities. Like we may know the vendor, product, the age that the published CVE is, and all of these different things. And like we also look at references, that are published in there and the CVE list or NVD. And we do a bunch of there's I think 1,400 different variables that we're looking at. And
Mhm.
so on any given day, it says, here's the state of this vulnerability, and there was or was not exploitation activity for every CVE. So for every day, for every CVE, it's either a yes or no exploitation activity and all the attributes for it. And that feeds into this model, and it says, all right, if I, give this thing a weight, how does that help me predict? That's terrible. What if I adjust it like this? And then it gets really complex because there's interaction effects. So like if something is a Microsoft vuln, it might have a certain weight, but if it's also a Microsoft phone and it's published in Metasploit, those two things together are going to create a third weight. And
Mhm.
so it factors in. There's so much complexity, and one of the things that sort of cracks me up is someone's like, "Hey, can I get a copy of that model? I want to tweak it." And I'm like, "You what? Like, no, you don't tweak this. Like, you allow it to learn, and it
On its
optimizes
own.
the
Yeah,
best
right.
decision." And essentially, it's an algorithm called XGBoost, which is basically a series of decision trees. So like it says, is it Microsoft yes or no? If it's yes, then go down this tree. If it's no, then go down this tree. And then it stacks a bunch of these trees up and uses the output and puts a series of trees together. And so by doing that, though, it creates a pretty advanced and absolutely black box algorithm, on what's doing what. But the good thing is, like, we can actually say, like, we can start to do some tweaking, and we're going to do a lot of this in the next release, but talking about how important is this feature. And we did some of that in the past. And like right now, the most important feature that comes out of the model is how many references are published on the CVE list
Hmm.
for that CVE. Just how many? Like, not even like what are they? Where are they? Anything's like, I think the average 4 or 5 years ago was a number of four references, and it's since dropped to about two or three on average. So if you see something, I think Log4Shell had like 200 references in the
Mhm.
CVE, and it's a really good indicator of popularity, people discussing it, things like that. So it's just a strange, very simple indicator that sort of shocked me. Like, what number of references? That's important,
Yeah.
so it's
I
just
can see
weird
that, but,
things
like,
like that.
I wouldn't have thought to count that, but you're right.
Yeah.
Like, it's definitely a measure of popularity, which is certainly a factor in the algorithm, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The miracle of data mining.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So how does the scoring work? Like, if someone's just going in and starts looking at some EPSS data, like how does that work?
So the only thing we publish is basically a probability between 0 and 1. Like if you go like EPSS, that's all there is. We do put another value in there called the percentile, which is basically what proportion of all the published CVEs are at or below this score. because, like what we found is single digit percent of CVEs are ever known to be exploited. Like depending on the research report, 2 to 7% of all CVEs are known to be exploited. So if you have a scoring system, you would expect 2 to 7% to be high, right? And the rest to be fairly low. And so what you see in EPSS is like, I don't know, 85% are under 2% probability. So like it's highly, highly skewed. Most of these things are rated really low. And then it sort of gets this long tail up there. And then it gets a bunch right at the top. So there's a little knob as you get towards near 100%. And so that's all EPSS publishes, just that score. And it is a probability. And we've calibrated that probability so that when we say 60%, like 60% of those are probably going to be exploited in the data. And so with that, you can actually now combine them. If you have an asset with 10 vulnerabilities, you can combine probability, and you look up how to combine, I want to know what is the probability any one of these are going to be exploited. Like, should I fix all of them? So you can combine that probability mathematically and get the probability that anything on this box is going to be exploited, any one of them. So because of that mathematical properties of probability.
Am I able to just share something
go ahead.
here? Or,
Yeah,
okay.
go ahead, Wade. Yeah.
Let me just share something, because I think this is I have to share my whole screen. All right, that's cool. No, I don't. All right. It kind of gets to your former question about how do we recommend organizations use it, and I think that kind of depends. This chart here is sort of trying to show we have these different measures of coverage. Think of that as the proportion of all known exploited vulnerabilities that you would fix if you fixed everything at this EPSS score or more. So, as you fix more and more, your coverage is gonna go up. This other notion of efficiency, it's kind of accurate, of all the things that you fix, what proportion of them were actually exploited, and then your overall level of effort, total number or proportion of vulnerabilities fixed. And different organizations are going to have different thresholds depending on their resources and risk tolerance and all of these other kinds of things. So, if you're risk averse, you want to minimize the chance that a potentially exploited vulnerability will be exploited, then you want to maximize coverage, and you probably want to use a really low EPSS score as your threshold for the trigger to fix things. If you're resource constrained and you're struggling and you kind of want to minimize your effort and with kind of biggest bang for the buck kind of approach, you probably have a higher EPSS score threshold. So, these kinds of things, there's not fix everything above X. There's a lot going on, and trying to supply this kind of information so that organizations can make those decisions is not natively in EPSS, right? Because like Jay said, you just get a score every day. But it's one of those on the outside. How do you use those scores and think about them and sort of drive them to decisions or actions?
Has it given you any indications as to why attackers choose to go after a particular vulnerability with an exploit?
I think if there's exploit code published, wait, what were the stats that we published? It was 7 times more likely to have exploitation activity.
Something like that. Yep.
I mean, depending, like I said, it depends on where it's published and all sorts of things. But certainly, I think there's an element of convenience when something is published or put in a Metasploit. Like it's super easy to run something in Metasploit. So I think that just makes it easier for people to run in the wild.
Remote code execution seems to be one that's picked on. That's probably this would be useful to me. Utility would be another factor.
Yeah, so something like the outcome, so like remote code execution is definitely going to drive what people want to do with a vulnerability. So or if they just want to do a DDoS or something, they're going to look for something that's DDoS. But the other thing too, I mean, like if they're going after remote code execution or something, and like it's a buffer overflow or something that has a certain amount of complexity, it's going to be different than local file inclusion or something where you can inject a file and have that included in a site or something. I mean, like depending on the difficulty in developing an exploit, I think that'll drive it. And I think it's the reason that EPSS is working is because it's a combination of all that, like what they want, how easy it is, their skill level, what do they know, what's available to them, like all of that is going to contribute to what gets used and executed and what they're after.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of debate about the recent SSH vulnerability as well, and I think it's encompassing a lot of the things that we're talking about right now, right?
Yeah.
It's we see it as security professionals like, wow, we should totally fix that. But then there's, pockets of us that are like, really, do we need to rush to fix this? Because the difficulty of exploitation and the time it takes, it could be a deterrent from people using it.
Yeah.
And to make it more complicated, the discussion of those things publicly probably increases the likelihood, or at least changes the likelihood that it will be exploited. So, there's
in
all of those.
which way do you think? Do you think you think attackers are more likely to exploit it if it's being talked about more, or just the opposite because it's too much in the spotlight?
Probably both, but I would guess probably the first one more. That like the more information there is about something, the easier it is to leverage it.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think, I think some of the more advanced state-sponsored groups may opt not to go for the things that are, easy to that are obviously going to be detected or something. So I mean, I don't know of any system right now that wouldn't have something for SSH, for that vulnerability pretty quick. And so depending on their goal, it might shift one way or the other.
There's all kind of cross correlation too, because we tend to talk about the things that are more widely distributed, which are also more likely to be attacked. And it's
right,
sort
just
of
in the
snowballs.
nature of
Yeah.
I mean, it's that debate over, back in the day, Macs don't get viruses, right? And it's attackers are focused on Windows because that's the larger percentage of operating systems deployed in enterprises today, and that's what they're going after, right? And so you have to account for that in the data, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the lucky thing is like the modeling accounts for that in the data. I don't have to count for anything. So
right. Yeah, we've always tried to. It's interesting, Jay, that you say that because we've always accounted for these things in our minds.
Yeah,
and like our brains can't keep all of these factors and apply them to a risk equation, but a computer can, right?
Yeah. As long as there's an outcome variable.
Yes.
And I think I have heard some complaints against EPSS, and I think one of the common complaints boils down to that prediction doesn't reflect my own mental math about this vulnerability. And in many cases, I think that's fair. If you assess a particular vulnerability to be worth remediating on the quick, because of various reasons, then do it. And I don't think that conflict between the vulnerability researchers' assessment of a vulnerability and some EPSS scores is like, oh well, EPSS sucks, because you got to remember there's dozens of vulnerabilities published each day. You can't possibly give attention to them all, right? And do that process of deep evaluation on them all. And so EPSS is really about, all right, let's remove the ones that someone's really going to dig into, separate those out. I think EPSS is really helping to triage the bulk of the rest of just the avalanche of vulnerabilities that we got to contend with, and rack and stack those in terms of exploitation.
Yeah, and Alan, I think you had a question along those lines of how do we navigate the waters with all these scoring and tracking mechanisms?
Yeah, and it's funny to me because we started the conversation with CVSS. Oh, it's so subjective and human, and you get a different interpretation from everybody. What we didn't talk about was downstream CVSS, where I receive it as the CISO, and I immediately task my team with, "Hey guys, tell me how much this is real for our shop in particular." Oh, we've mitigated that. We firewalled that. Okay, so the score is no longer a 9.0. It's by our own reckoning a 3.7. All this subjectivity all the way down the chain.
Yeah.
And then we talked about how it's MLAI and you guys are this hard data approach. And yet what I'm hearing from you is that, in fact, contextualization is incorporated in what you're doing, right? And I think that's fascinating to me that, I always joke about airline magazine syndrome. You get in front of the board of directors and somebody just flew there from another city and they read a half pager with an infographic in the airline, and now all of a sudden the board is challenging you about today's latest exploit, right?
Yeah.
And I joke about the CFI, the CISO freakout index. Oh, that's cool. It's only a
Yeah.
1 on the CFI. No big deal.
Yeah.
And it's that contextualization. So I guess, I wanted to ask you how you use CVSS, but I think you've already answered that. And so I guess the segue for that is, with all this brilliant contextualization and yet at the same time hard analytics driving it, I see a limiting factor in one thing, and so far what you guys have shown us, and that is if it's not in the CVE database, it's not in the EPSS. What about the other
Right.
vulnerabilities? Like that's the one piece of context I'm not seeing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let Jay take that, but let me say something real quick about contextualization. I think EPSS is contextualizing external variables, right? What do we know about the vulnerability? What do we know about exploit activity? All that kind of stuff. Not internal. So
Right.
your what you mentioned about do we have controls in place? Have we done this and that?
Yep.
That is not in the score at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
That needs to be layered on. But Jay, I'll let
The
you take
CFI
away
is still useful.
Yeah, exactly.
What was I going to take away?
The non
remember the other part.
CVEs, which is
Oh,
a
right.
challenge. That is
It
it is
is.
totally dependent on having a CVE.
Yeah. And there's, like I would love to do non-CVEs. The challenge is that, I think we're over 20 some different sources of data. And so like if you go to Metasploit and you're like, all right, I want to find everything that is exploiting a vulnerability, and I want to correlate what's in Metasploit to what I'm seeing somewhere else, exploit DB or on a advisory from vendors, like without that CVID, there's pretty much no way that a machine is going to do that accurately. You cannot say, oh, this is in this version of this software and that exists. And then you see somebody else mentioning that same software, maybe with or without a version. Is that the same thing?
Yeah.
So without that CVID to take all of these different data sets and to bring them together so they're talking about the same thing, it's nearly impossible. But I think that
non-CVE
might
ID.
be, yeah. And there's certainly a lot of that, like GitHub security advisories, or Red Hat has their own ID, and there's all sorts of IDs out there. They just have to be consistent, or at least some way to map between them.
Well, yeah, the data has to do whether it's a CWE or it's in MITRE ATT&CK, it has to carry that moniker. And how do you track it back to it's this vulnerability without a CVE ID,
right?
That then collects all that other tracking information and severity and whatever.
Yeah. So I agree. I think that's I don't know if I'd call it a shortcoming of EPSS. It's more like a shortcoming of the industry. And
I agree, Jay. It's not EPSS's fault. I'm a huge proponent of
I like
if
that.
it's a vulnerability in a piece of software, it needs a CVE. And it doesn't always
I like
happen.
that. I like that.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing too, like if we have a machine sort of looking at all this data and helping us, supporting our decisions, then something, like the Linux Foundation, by saying we're going to just make everything a vulnerability because, if there's a bug, it probably has some relevance to security at some point. And so they're putting everything in there. And a lot of people think that's terrible, that they want to try and keep the CVE clean for vulnerabilities. But I'm kind of like, bring it on, like if you're going to throw noise in there, great. Like I'll probably detect that. Hopefully the algorithm can start to figure out what's actual noise and what isn't, by descriptions and references and all these things and who's talking about what. Like all of that is going to help filter out the noise. So the more we can get in there, the more centralized identifiers we can create, I think the better it's going to be. There's going to be a lot of noise, but hopefully we can filter that out.
One thing I did in a conference presentation this year is I borrowed the concept of the hot crazy line. You guys ever seen that video? And it's hilarious. It's somewhat dated and not politically correct. I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not advocating for that. But the concept is, I'm like, what if I applied this concept to how we prioritize and manage vulnerabilities? And one of the things that I ended up with after I worked it out was like, look, if it's on a system that's very critical to my organization, it shouldn't matter what the severity level is or how it's scored.
Right.
Like if it's a vulnerability and it's like a 9 or a 10 critical to my organization, I pretty much I have to fix it. Like all the
Yeah.
other data we're going to funnel into that doesn't matter at that point. I
You
got to
you just
fix it
described
because
the
it's
CFI.
right. I got
Yeah.
to fix it because I have it in my environment. It's critical to my business operations, and
Hmm.
therefore I need to address it. Where I think EPSS and other scoring mechanisms come from are the other areas where of criticality to my organization. How do I make
Yeah.
sense of the, I've got 20% that I got to pay attention, but how do I manage the rest of it?
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
make
Totally.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with EPSS, like you're gonna the what was it, the CFI, the CISO freakout
CFI,
index.
CISO Freakout
Freak out.
I
Index.
think,
Yeah, I
so
like that.
like not only that, but like you also have sort of the I don't know if we can say like the security analyst freakout index where you get, like you get like, I don't know,
No, I
This
agree.
maybe
is
a
super
few
cool, and
hundred a
man, I'd love
month.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
few hundred CVs a month that they're able to analyze and say these are really important, and throw those on the top of the list. And then for everything else, then go look at EPSS.
Mhm.
So like it's going to fill in a lot of that gray area between like this is clearly something we got to address, or it's on a critical asset. All these things, these are the ones we just need to do. Now let's go check the scoring systems and see how the others fare, the
Yep.
other 10
Yeah.
million vulnerabilities in our network.
But
But
one
you
thing
guys are
Um,
that I
providing
also think organizations tend to give a high weight to, and I'm not sure if it takes into consideration, but like how easy or difficult it is to put the fix out,
yeah.
right? I think that's a huge
Yeah.
driver because it can be critical to the business. And look,
Yeah.
we do a lot of firmware security here at Eclipsium, right? And those are really hard to fix, not just hard to
Yeah.
Yep.
fix, but high operational risk as well.
Yeah.
And I think that really factors into whether or not people actually apply the fix.
Most
And we did
definitely. I mean,
we
we've
did a
we've analyzed this in the past, and
yeah, I
your
was gonna say that.
auto patching browsers and
Hmm.
operating systems are, I forget the stats now because it's been a few years, but I mean, I'm just going to call it 2 years faster than firmware and other
Yep.
stuff like
Yeah.
that. If you just sort of watch the remediation curve, it's ridiculous, and that's
The
exactly what's going on.
the other thing that we found, we did a survey with Kenna, I think it was like 2020, 2019, but we surveyed companies that we had the remediation data for, and we asked things that we don't see in the data, like, do you have automated software remediation
Hmm.
platform or something to automate a lot of your patches? And for the companies who said yes, they were like 4 times faster across the board. Like it was
Hmm.
one of the biggest drivers. Like forget the CVSS score, any other score. Like if they have any automated patching system, they're going to be way faster.
Right.
So it's a huge, like really good selling point for automated, rolling out of patches and stuff like that. So I think
Right.
I think
But
that is a big thing.
EPSS definitely helps with uh the problem that I think we have today in that we're going on the severity. However you want to measure that, CVSS
Yep.
or otherwise, we're just basing the whether I fix it or not on the severity. And I've seen organizations that base it on CVSS. If it's an 8.0 or greater,
Yep.
I got to fix it right now. But when you look at other data sources, as I'm sure you folks have as well, attackers don't just go after the what's ranked
No.
as critical in CVSS. EPSS should shake some of that stuff out, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because it
Yep.
doesn't matter whether it's a 3 or a 5 or if it's being exploited, that's important.
Yep.
It's that contextualization thing again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, I do have a stat for this because I'm looking at it. If you
Mm.
fixed everything that was CVSS score 8 or above, you'd fix just over half, 50%, 58% of known exploited vulnerabilities per
Like
EPSS. So
seven and
you'd
above.
you'd still miss a lot.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and actually, Jay, this says coverage is 58% for 8 plus. So
Okay. All right.
you're
I thought it
still
was seven.
missing a good chunk of stuff out there if you do that. And I think EPSS can help bubble up things that, for whatever reason, don't trigger a high CVSS score, don't generate a ton of industry discussion and buzz, and don't get on the get their own logo and stuff like that. There's still
Yep.
a sizable portion of vulnerabilities that are getting targeted and exploited that kind of slip under the radar from those
There's
things.
Yeah,
other
that
research from SonicWall that backs that up, right? And it's one of my concerns that I have about the way we evaluate risk overall in cybersecurity today is that we're still, I think, focused on remotely exploitable, high CVSS critical vulnerabilities, Whereas if you
Hmm.
look at a lot of the data, you just brought up certain data points. Sonic has some great points as well. And another show, I'm going to interview the people behind that because I think it's important. Like local privilege escalation, as it turns out, if you look at Microsoft vulnerabilities, they look at like 900 Microsoft vulnerabilities, is more commonly exploited in the wild than remote code execution vulnerabilities, right? And when I talk to my pen tester friends about that, they're like, well, yeah, because we fish our way into the organization, and then the game just becomes how do I escalate privilege? This could tie back to specific vulnerabilities and or techniques, which is harder to track. But I think we give that a much lower priority in our patching, and that frightens me.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this
Agreed.
ties into my question. I was going to ask is like MITRE ATT&CK, right? It's a kill chain, and a kill chain could
Right.
be a 2 and a 3 and a 1
Mhm.
on the CVSS, but all of a sudden you get a 10 result by
Right.
stacking these guys. How are y'all kind of interacting with that, right? Because we've got Kev, we've talked about a little bit, CVSS, we've
Yeah.
talked a little bit about. But then I'm thinking of that kill chain paradigm that Paul's bringing up. How does EPSS?
So that
How do y'all
I
jive
think
with that?
so I think that really gets to the impact. If something is exploited, I think the kill chain helps with that impact. And so this is one of the challenges I actually have to say, like, this vulnerability is going to have this impact. I think that's
Mhm.
really hard to say with the information we have
Yeah.
because of that kill chain. Like, it's people will see like a local privilege escalation and think like, well, they have to be on the box, forget it, it's low, whatever, but like if that's the fourth step in the chain, that's not a small problem, so like they're already on the box, they did some phishing or something, and they're on the box, now they need to escalate privilege. That is a big deal then. And so to say I'm going to just focus on the vulnerability and I'm going to estimate the impact, I think that might be a little premature. And so that's why, I mean, that's one of the reasons actually for EPSS I ignored that completely, because that is a super hard problem. Like
Yeah.
if all is one step in any number of attack chains, how do you know the impact?
Yeah.
Like
1 plus 1
it's
plus
you
1 is
can't.
10.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really hard to say the impact from this particular vulnerability being exposed is this. Like, I don't know,
Yeah,
if
there's
it's
other factors that go into
yeah.
impact,
Yeah,
right? And it's
absolutely.
impact is a huge weight with me too. I think oftentimes when I'm
Yeah.
trying to evaluate any particular vulnerability or exposure, I'm like, okay, but what would be the end result? And then you also have to kind of factor in a chain of vulnerabilities and or
Yeah.
activities. And if like, Alan's saying, if it leads to a 10, then that's bad. We got to fix all those things that lead up to it.
Yeah. Like what was the target breach when they, back, this is what, 10 years ago, but
The HVAC
it was
system.
their HVAC
Mhm.
vendor, and their credentials. So like, the impact of not having MFA on third party credentials, what is the impact to our, you know, point of sale systems? Like that's super remote, like
Yeah.
how unbelievably remote. And but still, like, it happened. So like tying this one thing to this range of outcomes, I think, is a really difficult task. So, and I'm really glad I don't have to do it in my life.
I think a factor that's interesting, and this is somewhat self-serving to Eclipse him because I spend a lot of time thinking about if an attacker were to compromise a system and the vulnerabilities and or level of access they have, right? If they get into BIOS firmware, they can circumvent other controls. How
Yeah,
do we measure circumvention of controls? It's a very difficult thing to
it
measure, no?
is. Yeah,
Right? Because
yeah,
you may say, well,
and
it does has it's a low severity, low impact to me because I've got these other things.
yeah.
But I'm like, wait a minute, if an attacker has this, they can totally get by all your other things.
Right. And so like in the case of EPSS, like we don't really need to measure that because we're measuring a proxy variable. Like, are they actually
Mhm.
doing that exploit that we're able to observe?
Mhm.
So like if they know they're going to circumvent a bunch of controls, maybe that's more attractive to them. And we may actually observe then the activity because they're trying it. So we have no idea like if something with more control, that circumvents, but if you see a BIOS attack, that generally will always have that attribute. We might say, oh, if it's a BIOS, vulnerability, let's go fix that because we're seeing all this activity around it. We may not
Right.
know it's because they're able to circumvent all the other controls, but we're seeing the activity, you
Yeah,
know.
it's tough to to observe something that's circumventing all of your controls and
Yeah.
observability, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's another thing about EPSS. It's all based on our ability to observe,
Yes.
and so something like local privilege escalation, we're not going to see in a network-based IPS
Hmm.
device. I mean, generally not. There's ways, but and so like what's weird is seeing things like we go back to CVSS. There are things in CVSS marked physical attacks that I see showing up in IDS logs. Like, how is that showing up?
Yeah,
And
right.
so like weird stuff like that. But I mean, like that is part of the challenge. Like, so I'm in the process trying to communicate with different EDR vendors about trying to get more on the desktop, trying to get more detections to help
Hmm.
us forecast future events.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's a hard problem. But any of these things, you have to compare it to something else. So like people will
Right.
bring up this objection, like EPSS is generally only seeing network traffic. And I'm like, yep, but is that still better than just relying on a CVSS base score?
Right.
Like, are we
Right.
still doing better with that than without it? So that's always a challenge, I think.
You guys are providing such a great thing here. I mean, you really are. Like I asked
Thanks.
some challenging questions. Paul asked some challenging questions. Bottom line is, you're doing something awesome. That external contextualization is something we lack, right? I mentioned the CVSS subjectivity thing. Well, in my shop, it's this, this, and this. I can
Yeah.
handle that. I
Yeah.
can't do what you guys are doing on my behalf,
Yeah.
right? So don't take my line of questioning the wrong way at all.
Yeah.
It's awesome what you guys are doing, and I think it's
Thanks.
fantastic. And I think it's great work, and I'm so glad you guys are doing it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I
Thank you.
like that we don't have to wait until something is exploited or even observed to predict and have this metric, right? Because oftentimes some of the challenges that we hear are, well, I'm in a peer group and they're not seeing attacks this way, so therefore I don't have to be worried about that. And I've always and I've experienced this throughout my career, and I'm like, wait, I don't want to wait until someone like in our industry has experienced this attack to
Right.
go
Yeah.
do something to prevent it, right? Like
Right.
if I know something
Wait for
could
the
be out
ISAC
there,
to
yeah,
inform you.
I want to address that. I don't want to wait, right? Because I could
Right.
be
Yeah.
the first one.
Yeah.
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 Especially if you're a tip of the spear there.
Yeah.
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 Um,
Yeah. Definitely. That's a
But
challenge.
I've had my dark web teams go research for me to find out, like, okay, is there script kiddie code out there for it? Is it in Metasploit? Is it some
Hmm.
really esoteric line of 20 lines of software that have to be really intelligently incorporated? How exploitable is this buffer overflow? Is that you can try to do that research yourself as the CISO. Yeah, good luck.
Yeah.
You just don't get
Yeah.
hard answers. You just don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, the other challenge with that is that you go out and then do the research, and then a week later it does show up. So like,
Right.
Right.
and that's
Right.
one of the
Right.
things that EPSS is doing. It's grabbing all of this data daily. And so
Yeah.
if all of a sudden tomorrow something does show up in Metasploit, it's going to affect that probability going forward.
Yeah.
And so you will see EPSS score. We publish it every day, so you'll see that score jump, or you see it
Mhm.
change in some way.
That's what I'm looking for.
Does it
It
does
it
it
Yeah,
beats going to my Slack channels and asking other CISOs, to Paul's point,
yeah,
"Hey, has that happened to you yet?"
yeah.
so but like recently we saw the Velvet Ant attack and Chinese attackers use a privilege escalation. I wouldn't call it privilege escalation, this particular one, not to get too in the technical weeds, but it was basically a breakout or escape
Hmm.
from the Cisco interface on the
So
NXOS
okay,
to the Linux operating system. And I think many of us would have scored that like, oh, well, they already got to be on the box, right? It's like, well, okay, so they were, and then they used this exploit.
yeah.
Does now that data get incorporated into EPSS to go, well, like this type of attack we've observed in the wild, we've seen it exploiting, so therefore in the future, it has a higher probability?
Yeah. Yeah. If there are things that have a pattern like that, it's going to increase in the future.
Yeah,
So,
that's awesome.
yeah. So, and there's weird things that show up. I don't have an example off the top of my head, but there's some things that have like it's a score I don't expect, and then I go look at the data, and there's a lot of them being exploited. And I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
I wouldn't have never guessed that. So like, there's a lot of things in this data that really challenge my intuition,
Right.
which I think is fantastic. Because like you go through, you spend all this time and all this experience that you collect, and you're only getting some small view of the entire ecosystem. And
Mhm.
so something like all this data collection we're doing, we're getting a much broader view, and it's going to change. It's changing my perspective, definitely.
Does supply chain vulnerabilities get scored differently? Is it not identified as a supply chain vulnerability? Is a vulnerability to you, or does the supply chain weigh in
It's
on that?
So right now, a vulnerability is a vulnerability. CVE is a CVE. I
Mhm.
think that there's room. One of the great things about EPSS, we're on our third version, and when we're plotting the progress, we've improved leaps and bounds. And
Sure.
I hope that continues. So like one of the things I hope we can do is to break out open source vulnerabilities from like firmware, from OT, from you know IoT. I mean, like these all are going to have little subtleties in the ecosystem that they exist in, and they're all going to attract or deflect attackers. And so like they're all going to sort of have their own sort of they're trying to model that ecosystem. I think they're all going to be subtly different, and we're probably going to see a benefit to say, hey, I want to just create a model for open source phones.
Right.
Let's just do that. Let's do another one for, I can't remember the example you had, Paul, like firmware things. Let's do one just on firmware, and try to figure out what really makes a difference in that world. The challenge then, of course, is like, what worlds do we pull out? you know,
and have
um,
good data on.
Yeah,
and have
open
good
source
data
is
on. Right.
probably better to get data on, right? If you could
Yeah, it's one of the
somehow
bigger
classify
requested
them
things.
as supply chain attacks because it's
Yeah.
it's open and usually gets a CVE, someone responds to it. You
Yep.
know, supply chains in commercial software is a much harder on so many levels, right?
Yeah. Yep. And we're seeing a lot more data come up in that space, because it's so important.
Right. Yeah,
Like
S
Google has
bombs
to.
are certainly a
Yeah.
step in that right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of work in that space. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
That's awesome. So back to I'm an organization now. I've listened to us talk about the various scoring mechanisms. What's kind of your overall advice as to how should I change if I have a program today? How should I change it or make it better based on what we discussed?
I I I'm kind of I would say start with the data, but I have a clear bias there. But like if you
Hmm.
go to first.org/EPSS, there's a statistics and download page or something like that where every day we're generating statistics about what we're scoring and everything we're seeing. But at the top it says download now. And it's a CSV that you can then open in Excel or whatever, and you see every CVE that's been published with a score.
Hmm.
Like start there, and look at those, sort it by number, by the score. If you can look at the vulnerabilities that are coming out of your scanner that you're trying to prioritize, can you mesh that up? Does
Yep.
it make any intuitive sense to you at all? you know um, so I think starting with the data would be my first choice. And maybe, like anything, you probably don't want to jam it in and say this is the new way. You want to look at what you're doing, compare to how it
Make it a
would look.
factor. Yeah,
Yeah.
make it a factor,
Yeah.
right?
Or
For
just make
sure.
it, a piece of information next to it. Like, hey, we're
Hmm.
saying prioritizing what we're doing, but if you look at that score, it's higher, lower, whatever. Like maybe it'll affect it, but just we'll figure out how it'll fit in over time here.
Right.
So
I'll add to that. Ask your vendors. Like, there's a growing number of vendors that are incorporating
yeah,
EPSS scores
Hmm.
that might save you some time in
yeah,
various tools that you're using. And if your favored one doesn't have an EPSS score, ask them, hey, maybe start ingesting that data because it's free. I mean, I'm not saying that so that we get money out of this.
right,
Yeah, yeah.
We don't get any money from people using it. We get satisfaction the more organizations and vendors that are using it, so that's great.
yeah,
But that's another thing to ask, because I think more of that will generate um, more use, and the more vendors that have incorporated EPSS into their tools, I am hopeful that they each of them are now potential data sources back into EPSS to
Right.
further improve it as well. So that could be a payoff down the road, which would be great.
Do you find that organizations come up with their own risk scoring system, or are they
absolutely,
modifying something and
absolutely.
customizing it? Yeah, like, how does that work?
All the above.
Yeah,
So
okay.
before I went back to school for statistics, 2010, I think. the 10 years prior to that, working in information security, I started out in cryptography as a crypto engineer, and then got into risk and risk analysis and how do we actually measure that. Uh,
Mm.
and yes, I think, and from what I can describe, I think most organizations, they implement a risk framework that I think the way it gets implemented is because nobody complains too loudly, right? Like people make something up, they throw
That's
it
a
in the
great point.
environment, and if nobody objects too loudly, it's in place until that person moves on or gets tired of it, and then somebody else comes along and is like, no, I got something way better. It's going to be
Mhm.
implemented unless somebody complains too loudly, right? And so like you get this sort of cycle of risk models that are just sort of, based on your intuitive opinion of weights, what should be, and I mean, they're better than nothing, I think.
Mhm.
But then again, no one really measures the success. And that's one of the things Doug
That's
Hubbard
the
talks
tricky
about
part, right?
in failure of risk management. He says the biggest failure of risk management is trying to figure out if it works or not.
Mm.
Like nobody really knows if it works or not. That is the biggest failure. There's no feedback.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that there's a ton for everybody that I talked to about EPSS. They have something in place now,
Mhm.
right? And it's usually a combination of like, I'm going to collect these variables, I'm going to collect these opinions, I'm going to put them together and stir them up and pour out a prioritization list. And it's all variations on the same theme with different variables and different opinions and things like that. But yes, I think everybody has generally their own process, and they all have a process to override whatever their process says.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, just from the CISO perspective on that one,
Uh,
I've seen everything from completely embracing the subjectivity. I've got one CISO
yeah.
buddy who says, "I don't talk about probability, I'll talk about plausibility." It's kinda like my
Hmm.
CFI joke, right? Like, how likely
Yeah.
is the CISO to be surprised by this? How likely is the IT team to be surprised by this? Plausibility, totally
Yeah.
subjective.
Yeah.
And then on up into Bayesian math, Monte Carlo sims, and all that goodness.
Right.
And then in between is your standard 5 by 5 non-ordinal.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Heat map, yellow to red, green.
Right, but boards
Yeah.
love red, yellow, green,
Yep.
I
They
mean,
do, unless they're colorblind.
right.
So you guys said you had other research that was going to be released soon. I don't know if you want to tease our audience with some things you got coming up.
a study on EPSS. It'll publish right now. Published date is July 30th, right before Black Hat. So when did you say this episode would publish? Like
Next week,
17th?
17th. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple weeks after this, look for that. It'll be on Scientia.com somewhere. I don't have a link yet, but that's the date. And
Yep.
I mean, we go into the history, looking at EPSS performance. We show how performance has improved from version 1 to 2 to 3.
Mhm.
The measures that we're using to say good, bad, better, worse. Measure things like the KEV, CVSS, varying scores. Look at the various components, attributes of vulnerabilities and how they contribute. So a lot of stuff in there that I think would
And
be very interesting to folks listening to this.
yeah, so like, I mean, one of the things, we don't have a product we're selling here that we're pushing necessarily, and so it's all just research. And one of the cool things that we looked into pretty heavily was the straight exploitation activity. How long
Mhm.
from something published until we see exploitation in our data? How widespread is it? How many devices are reporting actual exploitation activity when it is an exploit in the wild? And is it every day? Is it every other day? What do those things look like for exploitation activity? And of course, the answer is it varies wildly. And that's one of the key takeaways, I think, is how interesting and how much variety there is in
Mhm.
exploitation activity itself. So,
How sporadic it is. Yeah.
yeah.
Kind of makes me lean towards we should just fix this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Because if
Yeah.
it's sporadic, you can't really pretty like you just got to fix it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But,
But again, we
then
can't
there's
fix
going to be,
everything, which is why we have all these metrics,
and then, yeah,
which
but
is
there's
good.
going to be some portion that are pretty clearly you can totally delay. Like
Yes.
you
Yes.
clearly do not have to fix these. If you can identify those, maybe it's hard to get everything you need to prioritize, but if you can take 80% of these things and say, I can safely delay these,
Mhm.
that's pretty awesome.
Outstanding. Well, Wade and Jay, thank you very much for coming on Below the Surface today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone
guys.
for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.